Solo and the Dentist. No one in Solo's household enjoyed going to the dentist, in particular Dad. The children were better patients than Dad. If Solo had to go to the dentist, he would have been a better patient than Dad. Dad had such a fear of the dentist that the dentist himself had recently said that Dad was, in fact, the third worst patient he had. When Dad had told his wife what the dentist had said, his wife had replied that she was not surprised. She knew her husband hated going to the dentist so much that he would put off doing routine checkups and would leave it all so late that by the time he did go, Dad would need a filling. Dad had recently gone in for a checkup, and the dentist had informed Dad that he needed not one, but 2 new fillings. Dad had made an appointment to have these done the next week. He was not looking forward to the visit one bit. "It's your own fault," Mum had told him. "If you went to the dentist more often, you wouldn't need so much work." If Dad had been hoping for some sympathy from Mum, he wasn't going to get it. Solo had been listening to this conversation in his usual spot under the large kitchen table as Mum and Dad discussed Dad's upcoming dental visit. Solo, quite naturally, had never been to the dentist, so he had no idea what it was about the dentist Dad found so upsetting. Solo only had a vague idea about what a dentist actually did. He got the idea it was something to do with teeth, but why any human would want to do anything to another human's teeth was beyond him. The closest experience Solo had to the dentist was when he went to the vets so they could look him over. Solo did not like going to the vet. When he suspected he was being taken to the vet, he would refuse to get in the family's SUV and simply lay down on the ground, daring a member of the family to force him into the car. If Mum was trying to get Solo to the vet by herself and Solo refused to go, she would try and tempt Solo with a treat. She would wave the treat from the luggage area of the SUV, tempting Solo to jump up. Solo had fallen for this ploy a few times, but had soon figured out Mum's little games. From then on, Solo would simply refuse to get in the car, and Mum would have to call Dad to come out, pick Solo up, and place him in the back of the SUV. While Solo found the whole process beneath his dignity, he felt at the very least he was making Mum and Dad pay a small price for taking him to the vet. Once he was at the vet, he was prodded by the doctor just to see if Solo was still as healthy as he seemed. This included looking in Solo's mouth and examining his teeth. The vet would pry apart Solo's lips and stare at his gums, too. Had Solo known what a dentist really was, he could have had some sympathy for Dad. But at least Solo didn't have to worry about having his teeth drilled. Solo, laying under the kitchen table, couldn't understand why Dad was frightened by the dentist. If all the dentist did was pull Dad's lips apart to look at his gums, and if Solo could handle that, then surely Dad could handle it too. Dad complained some more about going to the dentist, then decided the best thing he could do in order to calm himself down was to go and play some golf. Solo watched him drive away and decided that the next time Dad went to the dentist, then he was going to go too. After all, if Solo wasn't afraid of the dentist, then why should Dad be? Perhaps if Solo was there with Dad, showing that there was nothing really to worry about, then Dad would become less afraid. The day of Dad's dental visit arrived, and Dad had taken the day off work in order to mentally prepare himself and to give himself time to recover. His wife had raised her eyebrows at this. As she pointed out, the kids had to have fillings every once in a while, and even they didn't complain as much as Dad. Solo was well aware that Dad was to visit the dentist, as Dad had seemingly talked about nothing else for days. The trick for Solo to figure out was how to get Dad to take him to the dentist. If Solo could show that he really wanted to see what a human dentist looked like, and that simply having someone examine your gums was no big deal, then Solo was convinced he could help Dad overcome his fears. Dad readied himself for his ordeal. He took a sip of strong coffee and went out to the SUV. Dad stopped. For there, waiting for Dad at the back of the SUV, was Solo, sitting on his haunches, looking up at Dad with a big grin on his face. Dad recognized that look from Solo as he'd seen it many times. It was Solo's "look at me" face. Often it was accompanied by Solo's "I want something" bark. Dad looked at Solo. "What do you want, Solo?" he asked. "You need to move, boy." Solo had strategically placed himself at the back of the SUV for two reasons. Firstly, this was where he would need to be in order to jump in the car. And secondly, the car was parked in such a way that in order to get out of the drive, it would need to be turned around. And in order to turn it around, Dad would need to go backwards. With Solo in the way, Dad couldn't reverse. "Come on, Solo, move it," Dad said. Solo simply stayed put and grinned at Dad. "Solo, come on, you're making me late." Solo didn't move. Dad grabbed Solo's collar in a fruitless attempt to make Solo move. As has been described many times, Solo was a large, strong, heavy dog, and if he didn't want to move, then the only way to move him was to pick him up, which was something Dad didn't want to do, as he was wearing some nice clothes, and he knew Solo's white fur would end up all over him. Dad thought for a moment. "You want to come for a ride, is that it?" Solo simply grinned. Dad gave up and opened the rear door of the SUV. Solo immediately jumped in, and Dad, not for the first time, wondered why he had ever agreed to get a dog. Dad sped to the dentist's office. He was anxious to get the visit over and done with as fast as possible. When they arrived, Dad leapt out with the intention of leaving Solo in the back of the car. The day was cool and grey, and Solo would have been just fine. But Solo had other ideas. He needed to go into the dentist with Dad, not simply wait in the car if he was to show support for Dad. Solo therefore put part 2 of his plan into action. Just as Dad closed the driver's door, Solo let out a howl. A high-pitched, very loud howl, followed by his infamous, high-pitched, repeating, "Pay attention to me!" bark. Dad stopped. So did some other people nearby. They looked at Dad suspiciously. "What's that man doing to that poor dog?" they seemed to be saying. "Solo, be quiet," Dad said, embarrassed. Solo ignored him and continued to howl and do his high-pitched bark. The small crowd started to gather, muttering to themselves about how this man was ignoring his dog, who was obviously in distress. Dad could feel himself starting to turn red. "Perhaps we should have brought him a cat instead," he thought. Solo kept up the howling and barking, tilting his head towards the ceiling of the SUV for added effect. Dad felt he had no choice. He opened the rear door of the car to try to get Solo to stop with all the noises as the small crowd still watched. But instead of Dad being able to get Solo to stop, Solo immediately jumped down and stood by Dad, pleased as punch that he had been able to get his way. "The things I do for Dad," Solo thought to himself. "How lucky Dad is to have me in his life." Dad was thinking quite the opposite at this point. Here he was, late for an appointment he didn't want in the first place, and he had to deal with an unruly dog. Deciding he had no choice, Dad grabbed Solo's lead from the back of the car, fastened it to Solo's collar, and led him towards the dentist's office, the small crowd continuing to give Dad dirty looks as he and Solo walked by. Dad decided he would have to leave Solo with the dentist's receptionists. He just hoped they wouldn't mind. Solo, on the other hand, had other ideas. He had no intention of waiting in reception. If he was going to see what a human dentist was like, and in order to comfort Dad, he would need to be in the dentist's examination room with Dad. Solo's plan was to place a paw on Dad's leg when the dentist looked at Dad's gums. "I don't like going to the vet," thought Solo, "but what's so difficult about having someone look at your gums?" Dad led Solo into the dentist's small reception area. No one else was waiting. The receptionist looked up, smiled at Dad, then paused as she noticed Solo for the first time. A dog here, she thought. She checked again just to make sure she wasn't seeing things. You really shouldn't have a dog in here," she said to Dad. "It's unhygienic. He could carry germs." Solo was offended. Him? Not clean? Certainly if he had been rolling in a muddy puddle, he could see her point, but it hadn't rained for days, and Solo was, for once, an immaculate, pure white ball of fluff without a speck of dirt anywhere. Solo found being this clean quite unnatural and against his nature, but he was pleased that, at least this once, he could say it without any shadow of a doubt that he was as clean as anyone currently in this dentist's office. Before Dad could reply, the dentist himself appeared. Greeting Dad, he looked down and noticed Solo. "Good heavens," he said as he knelt down to shake Solo's outstretched paw. "I recognize you from the golf club." It was true, Solo had been given an honorary membership at the golf club, and he had even had his photo mounted on the wall of the club. "Yes, sorry," said Dad. "He refused to stay in the car." "Never mind," replied the dentist. "Bring Solo through to the examination room. We can't have a fellow club member waiting outside, now can we, Solo?" Solo grinned. He couldn't agree more. The dentist led them through to his examination room. Solo was amazed at how comfortable it all looked, what with the large chair that Dad lay down on. Solo presumed it was for taking a nap. Solo still couldn't understand why Dad was scared of the dentist, although Solo was puzzled by all the strange-looking things hanging from wires above Dad's head. "Whatever are they for?" thought Solo. Solo looked around more. The office was decorated with fishing trophies. The office even had a life-sized fisherman in the corner. He was dressed in all the correct gear, including holding a fishing net. Solo decided the dentist liked to fish. Solo looked closer at him. He was a small, older gentleman, with an equally small, crackly voice. To Solo he looked perfectly harmless, reinforcing Solo's view that Dad was making a fuss for no reason at all. After all, there seemed to be a nice bed. The dentist was a small man who seemed harmless, and there was even soft, relaxing music being played in the room. It all seemed very calm to Solo. Solo was directed by the dentist to lay down near the end of the bed-chair thing that Dad was lying on. Solo therefore had a clear view of what was going on while not getting in the way. The dentist told Dad to open his mouth wide. Then he took a large, silver, pointy thing and began to probe around inside Dad's mouth. "That's weird," thought Solo. "What's all that about? Why would they do that? The vet never did that to me." He continued to watch as the dentist now moved on to another interesting device. He held the largest needle Solo had ever seen. Solo had had some shots at the vet's, but this needle dwarfed them. Dad squirmed a little as the dentist numbed Dad's gums. Solo's eyes got bigger. Weird, he thought. I never had that at the vet. After a few minutes, the dentist pulled down one of the instruments that was hanging above his head. He tested it. It made a very high-pitched sound. The sound made Solo want to howl in unison. Solo, to his credit, resisted the temptation. Dad tensed as the dentist moved the drill closer to Dad's mouth. Then he started to drill. The result was the strangest sound Solo had ever heard. This time, Solo couldn't resist the temptation to howl. Every time the dentist started to drill, Solo would lift his head and howl along. And every time the dentist stopped drilling, Solo would stop howling. Dad sat up, drool sliding out of the side of his mouth. Solo, please stop. At least, that's what he attempted to say. Thanks to the numbing injection he had received, what he said sounded like this. Solo, please stop. While Solo didn't exactly understand what Dad was attempting to say, he more or less got the message. Dad lay back down, and the dentist got to drilling again. Immediately, Solo let out a howl, and in order to get more volume, Solo sat up on his haunches and really let loose. A patient in the next room who was having his teeth cleaned told the hygienist, "Wow, that poor guy, he's having a terrible time." The hygienist nodded her head in agreement. The dentist did his best to ignore Solo, but Solo's howling was too much, and he was about to drag Solo out of the room by his collar when Solo stopped. Solo had noticed Dad's discomfort in the dentist's chair. This bothered Solo. He didn't like to see members of his family suffering in any way. So he stopped howling, walked over to Dad, and sitting back down on his haunches, placed a paw in Dad's hand. The dentist looked down at Solo. "I think your dog wants to help," he told Dad. Dad looked at Solo and replied, "I think he does." For the rest of the session, Solo kept his large paw on Dad's hand. Dad continued to squirm and gurgle and tell the dentist to "Please hurry up," but feeling Solo's paw gave him much comfort. About an hour later, Dad and Solo were home. Solo in his usual spot under the large kitchen table, Dad nursing his sore mouth and trying to drink a cup of coffee. Unfortunately, due to his mouth still being numb, much of the coffee dribbled down his chin and onto the table. Some landed on the floor next to Solo, who promptly licked it up. As for Solo, he now understood a little bit more about the dentist. Not for the first time, Solo was pleased he was a dog.